The two main subgenres for the genre of newspaper are local and national newspapers. In this video, I will be exploring the difference between these two subgenres of newspaper, and in the process discuss the generic conventions of these two subgenres through my comparison of the two. To exemplify this comparison, I will first be examining a copy of The Times, which is a national newspaper, and the Rotherham Advertiser, which is a local newspaper. The key differences between the types of stories conveyed in local newspapers in comparison to national newspapers are that local news stories are normally only relevant to the local community in which the newspaper is produced. For example, on the Advertiser front cover, the story conveyed is one of a man being stabbed repeatedly at a car wash in Rotherham, and although this is considered significant to the local community, it is not of significance nationally. Whilst in comparison, the Times front cover depicts a story around the issue of bird flu, which predicted to affect the whole country is of national significance and hence in a national paper. So apart from the scale of significance behind the stories being usually depicted by the subgenre of the newspaper, there is also a difference in the types of story conveyed in national newspapers in comparison to local newspapers. And this difference is that national newspapers tend to focus on political, scientific and financial stories, only ever branching into the realm of human interest, crime and violence, when the stories are particularly sensational and or shocking. Whilst in comparison, local newspapers tend to focus on human interest stories and stories centred around crime and violence, as they are seen as more newsworthy due to their significance to the local area, as the locality of an event dictates its significance to the target demographic of the newspaper, and as the events portrayed in local newspaper stories are of a close locality to the target demographic, they are viewed with high significance. However, this does not mean that stories related to politics, science and finance aren't depicted in local newspapers, just that they will only be conveyed in a local newspaper if they are seen as particularly significant and or sensational to the target demographic, hence making most stories of these genres in local newspapers of local, not national, interest. To compare the style of national newspapers in comparison to local newspapers, I will be analysing the following factors of the two papers I am comparing as generic examples: the mise-en-scène elements used, the masthead, the layout, the photography used, and finally the adverts employed in the papers. To begin then, I will first look at the use of the mise-en-scène elements of colour and setting, as these are the most distinctly contrasting mise-en-scène elements present in the two pieces. To begin, the element of colour contrasts in the two texts, with the Times appearing much duller than the Advertiser. However, the main use of colour on the Advertiser is to make the paper stand out alongside its competitors and hence make its target demographic buy it. Whilst in comparison, colour is used sparingly in the Times, as the general Semitic feel of the paper is one that connotes tradition, and too much colour would in a sense damage the extent of this connotation. And finally, the element of setting contrasts, as the local paper depicts generic everyday local settings, which reflects the importance of locality in local news stories, whilst the national paper gives them more dramatic and worldly settings, with a dramatic and gruesome image being portrayed underneath the front cover headline and a worldly setting being used in an image that we infer to be of a hostage taken by terrorists in another country on the left-hand side of the front cover. The next factor I will analyse is how the mastheads differ between local and national papers. The main difference between the Times masthead and the Advertiser masthead is the use of juxtaposition. The Times masthead incorporates juxtaposition into its masthead between the central image and the words, which, with the words being in a serif font, hence connoting traditionalism, and the image being also of a traditional nature, we get a semiotic connotation of the paper being a traditional newspaper, and hence through this association we infer the newspaper is a reliable source of information, as it has been operating successfully for a long period of time. Whereas the Advertiser masthead does not incorporate an image into its masthead, and hence only expresses juxtaposition between the two pieces of text that make up the masthead to convey the target demographic of the paper as being people from Rotherham. Moving on, the next factor I will analyse is the factor of layout, and how this differs between local and national newspapers. For analysis, this factor conveys two distinct differences between local and national newspapers. The first is that national newspapers are more uniform in their layout style, whilst local papers are not as consistent and a bit sporadic. And finally, the second distinct difference expressed is that advertising space is much more marginalised in national newspapers, whilst in local newspapers it appears to be more dominant. Penultimately, the next factor I will consider is the difference in photography used in national and local newspapers. The main difference between the photography employed in local and national papers is that through comparison we infer that national newspaper photography has undergone more planning and precision in order to achieve certain connotations than local newspapers photography, which we infer to be quite basic and bland. Finally, the last factor I will consider is the use of advertisements present in local and national newspapers and how they differ. To begin, we have already established through reviewing the differences in layout that advertisements are marginalised in national newspapers in comparison with local newspapers. However, there is also one more distinct difference between the use of advertisements used in national and local newspapers, and this is the type of adverts being conveyed. National newspapers, such as The Times, generically advertise their contents through contents plugs, hence creating advertisements centred around the contents of the newspaper to attract its target demographic to buy it, whilst in comparison, local newspapers, such as the Rotherham Advertiser, generically use competition plugs in order to attract the audience to buy the paper through the prospect of winning a prize, and general business advertisements in their newspaper. And this is due to the fact that on a local level, businesses employ the advertising medium of newspapers more commonly than national businesses, which opt for the more widespread mediums of television and websites. Therefore, for local newspapers, the use of local business advertising would make up a large sum of their revenue, with the cover price, if applicable, being much lower than a national newspaper. Now, I am not saying that the contrasting newspaper subgenres don't employ the types of advertisement generically contained within the other, but more often than not, they stick to these generic conventions, and this is due to many reasons, such as the business-related reason I spoke of earlier, which would make a local newspaper favour business advertisement over contents plugs, and the simple fact that a competition plug wouldn't be as appealing on a national scale, as there would be less chance of winning for the demographic than if the competition was only on a local scale. As stated earlier, the major difference between the types of story conveyed in local newspapers in comparison to national newspapers is the scale of the story's significance and the genres of story usually included in the two subgenres of newspaper. However, in this section, I'm going to expand on this information related to the narratives and types of stories conveyed in local newspapers in comparison with national newspapers by examining the front cover of two national and local newspapers and the stories conveyed on them through cross-reference with Galtung and Rouge's conditions in order to establish which conditions generally need to be fulfilled for stories to appear in the two contrasting subgenres of newspaper. And then I will go on to examine the agendas of national papers in comparison to local newspapers in order to determine how the narratives of stories portrayed in local and national newspapers are affected through the agenda of the newspaper and hence ideology. To begin this examination, I will first look at the two national newspaper front covers from the Times and the Guardian. For a story to be considered for a national paper, such as the Times or Guardian, I have determined through my analysis of these two front covers that it must fulfil some of these 9 conditions stated by Galtung and Rouge. They must be of a national threshold, be unambiguous, however in some cases, especially related to political stories, this is not always possible, as controversy can play a part in this context. They must have cultural proximity, have a sense of continuity, such as the Times story related to bird flu, which has been a continuing and pressing issue for the British public. They must have relevance to an elite nation or person, have personalisation, especially in the field of politics, where, for example, Tony Blair in The Guardian is personified as the Labour Party at his time at office. And finally, if a story has some form of negativity, it is generally seen as more newsworthy, as we see it as more sensational. Moving on then, I will now examine the two local front covers from the Rotherham Advertiser and the Dearne Valley Weekender, which convey that there are five main conditions Galtang and Rouge stated that are considered to have newsworthiness for a local news story. And these are a sense of negativity to the story, with, like in a national newspaper, stories of a negative nature being generally considered more newsworthy than a sense of positivity in the story. The idea of the event being portrayed in the story being of an unexpected and hence sensational nature, a sense of local cultural proximity, a sense of unambiguity in the content of the story, and finally have a local threshold in order to ensure the story is of significance to the local demographic. Finally then, the agendas of national papers in comparison with local papers can generally be defined in the fact that local papers generically work with an agenda that is from the viewpoint of the local community, whilst national newspapers often work with a simple journalistic agenda of portraying the news, as not every view from a target demographic could be expressed without contrasting. Also, the agendas of national newspapers are often affected by political ideology, with the Times, for example, being pro-conservative, and this in turn affects the narrative and mode of address of the stories portrayed in national